Leif, good to see you. Let's talk about India first. Let's talk about inflation. It is the biggest problem. We've had 12 interest rate hikes since 2010. Why is the inflation rate so stubborn? And do you think interest rates will carry on rising?
Well, we actually do expect that they will hike at least one more time, the central bank, the RBI. The reason for this very elevated level of inflation in India is basically that the economy only dipped relatively in a shallow dip after the global financial crisis, then very quickly recovered. So what happened was that the slack that was left in the economy evaporated very quickly, and we ended up in a situation where you had excess demand. You still have excess demand in India, and that's building up core inflation pressures in the economy.
And the hikes by the central bank, they were very step by step. Was that, in hindsight, perhaps a mistake? They should have raised rates quite significantly to perhaps give a shock to the economy.
I mean, I think both monetary policies should have been tightened faster, and also fiscal policy should have been tightened faster. There was much too loose fiscal policy last year, in my view, and those two factors has contributed certainly to these build-up in demand-led inflation pressures. You're absolutely right.
Well, borrowing costs now are surging to levels not seen since Lehman Brothers. We've also seen a slump in international bond sales by India's biggest companies. Could we soon be seeing a liquidity problem for many of these Indian companies, or not yet? What's your view on that?
I mean, not at the moment as well. And I also think it's important when you look at the borrowing cost of Indians. If you deflate it by inflation, the real borrowing cost is actually quite low still in India. If you look at credit growth in India domestically to the private sector, it's actually holding up quite well at more than 20%. So what we're seeing is a slowdown in growth. It's a moderation in growth. It's not a collapse in growth. And it's a slowdown that's needed to take care of these inflation pressures.
Well, we're seeing the Sensex up there now. It's lost about 20% in the year to date. We know that growth is moderating, but to what extent do you think is India isolated from the major problems that we're seeing in Europe and indeed America?
Yeah. They certainly are a lot more isolated than other countries in the region. They're much less dependent on, for example, exports. They have a relatively closed capital account, so they're less dependent on foreign capital inflows than other countries are as well. So that, to some extent, insulates them somewhat more against global economic spillovers.
Now, while India has been aggressively raising rates, other countries in the region, ASEAN countries, may have been picking up rates a bit, but they seem to have largely held back a bit. Is that wait-and-see approach an approach that is wise as far as you're concerned? Because other countries in that region, you know, they've still got pretty strong growth rates, but also inflation is still a problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think if you talk about Asia more generally in terms of the approach to monetary policy, I think there certainly is room to pause at the moment, considering the downside risk to global growth. And also in a number of these Asian countries, as we mentioned before, they're more exposed to global headwinds than India is, for example. So it makes sense from a sort of risk management perspective to maybe press the pause button for now.
And where do you see the best growth prospects and indeed the best opportunities? Which countries, which areas of industry?
I mean, I think in the very short term now with these global headwinds, of course, the countries that are more insulated against global spillovers, like India, like Indonesia, they offer more, shall we say, growth protection in this environment as well. But I think if you look over the medium term, the broader Asian region, the ASEAN region more generally actually offers very good medium-term growth perspectives.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Leif Eskesen, he's a Southeast Asian economist at HSBC. Thank you very much indeed for giving us your insight into what's happening in India.